Welcome to Kendall and Cooper Talk Mysteries. I'm Julie Cooper, a writer and half of the duo bringing you this regular podcast series focused on mystery, suspense, and thriller fiction. I know Wendy's anxious to question our special guest, but first, quick thanks to my brother Chris Squires for his original composition and performance of our theme song, The Man in the Panama Hat. For sure, our lives just wouldn't be the same without music. We're almost at the year's end, and it's been a challenging one on many fronts, personally and professionally, for many of us. Wendy and I have now completed over 30 episodes. Hard to believe. So our gratitude goes out to all of you, our listeners and readers, and especially a shout out to our listeners on KBFG at 107.3 FM in Seattle. Our focus for this episode is on the magic of books. I want to celebrate the gift of reading, of literacy, and the magic of enjoying books. Stephen King referred to this when he said, "Books are a uniquely portable form of magic." It's true. And Anne Lamott, one of my favorite writers who wrote an amazing book on writing, said this, "For some of us, books are as important as anything else on earth." What a miracle it is that out of these small, flat, rigid squares of paper unfolds world after world after world, worlds that sing to you, comfort, and excite you. And now it's time to introduce our guest. He's a native New Yorker who we're happy to say now lives in Seattle. He was trained as a linguist specializing in Romance languages and spent 15 years in Hollywood doing post-production work, running large international operations in subtitling, localization, and visual effects. This writer has produced an outstanding series of mystery novels set in the 60s, which I guess now places them into the historical category. Not sure what that says about me, but I digress. He's had a very good year. After being nominated several times, he's won the Anthony for Best Paperback Original and won the McCavity Award for Best Historical Mystery for the book Heart of Stone. His titles include Sticks and Stone, No Stone Unturned, Stone Cold Dead, Cast the First Stone, and of course, Heart of Stone. It's my pleasure to welcome an exceptional writer from the Pacific Northwest, James Ziskin. Welcome.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Wendy, for having me. I'm really, really excited about being here.
Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. I really have enjoyed your addictive Ellie Stone Mystery series. I just can't stop. I enjoy the early 1960s period. I love the characters, the stories, and also the challenge to solve the mysteries. So congratulations on your next one, A Stone's Throw, that's available June 5th of 2018. And can you tell us a little about what Ellie will be facing next year?
Sure. I would preface all of that by just adding just a little bit to what you said about the series. It's set in the early 60s. It tends to move around a little bit. It's mostly settled in upstate New York, but Ellie Stone, my protagonist, has solved mysteries in New York City, in the Adirondack Mountains of New York, in Los Angeles, as well as in this small town. She's a small town newspaper writer in 1960, 61, 62. And she is trying to forge a career as a woman in a man's world. So I'll just say that, and then move on to the next book and to your question, Wendy, which is what is Ellie going to be facing next year? So A Stone's Throw comes out June 5th of 2018, as you mentioned, and it's set in the August world of thoroughbred racing at Saratoga Springs, New York, which is just a stone's throw from the small town of New Holland where Ellie Stone works at that newspaper.
Okay.
But in every other way, it's worlds away. Saratoga in August is a remarkable place. It's just filled with there's just this influx of money and of people from all over the world for the 30 or 35 days of racing, which is all the thoroughbred meet lasts at Saratoga every late July and early August and through August. So and it really changes the town. Now Saratoga today is a beautiful, quaint, charming place, even all year round. Although it's something special in August. But in the early '60s, it had experienced some level of decline, and but all of that did disappear when August rolled around, because you had this, as I mentioned, all of these people coming to the race course and staying in Saratoga for 3-4 weeks sometimes, bringing with them a lot of money and a lot of glamour, and hopefully in the case of my book, some intrigue.
Oh.
So Ellie is going to be investigating a double murder
Wow.
on a ghostly stud farm in Saratoga County. And there's quite a bit of racetrack and excitement and fun as usual, and also a lot of seriousness as well.
Yeah. Oh, what a great setting, something really kind of different. It does sound intriguing.
Well, I do like to move things around, and not just to avoid the so-called Cabot Cove syndrome of having too many murders in this small town, but that is one of my motivations. But I also think, I like to tell myself that, no two murders are alike. So why should I don't want the mysteries in this series to feel like cookie cutter plots or settings. So I do like to move her around. Again, this is within 20 miles of the town where she is living. So it's not a major, stretch to have her, to have her investigate these murders, because they were committed on a farm that was owned by really the most important and prominent family in New Holland, New York, in the 19th century. The family that built the carpet mills, the family that later took the carpet mills south and orphaned the town and abandoned it in that way. But this was in the heyday. The Shaw family in my books were the most powerful industrial barons of the 19th and 20th century in this small town of New Holland, New York. So there is that local connection, and that's obviously her newspaper is very interested in the murders because they occurred on that farm.
Oh, yeah, that's fascinating. And, I think it's interesting, too, to take a character sort of out of their normal element and put them somewhere else. And for the reader to see, how they react to something different, in a different environment.
I agree. I think I think that it, by default, creates a certain amount of tension and interest when your character is out of his or her element, and has to learn something perhaps as well along with the reader. So Ellie is learning, for example, in this next edition about horse racing. She knows nothing about it, but her closest friend, who appears in all of the books, Fadge, who is just her best friend, who owns a shop across the street from her apartment.
Uh-huh.
He is a horse racing expert and quite an inveterate gambler as well. And to his detriment, he's got a bit of a gambling addiction, at least on horses. Yeah.
Oh. Well, your writing is beautifully unique in the language, the rhythm, the story itself, and how the story unwinds in each of your books. And it seems like there's a real mix of your wonderfully varied life experiences, your studies of literature and romance languages, your photo news of production and writing that you did yourself, and your experiences living and working in several countries. What is it that, with all those life experiences, what is it that sparked the magical inspiration in you? What made you say, oh, I think I'll write mysteries?
Good question. I started out, at a very young age wanting to write books. I just, and I wrote really bad books starting from the age of 12. They mostly tended to be historical books. There's something about traveling in time and place that appeals to me. And I do like that, that old saw that you should write what interests you and what, that I think that's the best a writer can do. But, for years, then career and studies and things got in the way. And then somewhere in the 80s and early 90s, I think it was in the 1980s, I just got on a kick of reading some mysteries. And coincidentally enough, one of the series that really appealed to me at that time, and I haven't done anything like this until the next book, one of them was Dick Francis's books, which revolve around horse racing in the UK. And they're great books. And his son continues to write. He continues writing that kind of horse racing kind of thrillers today. And so that was one of the things. But there were so many writers, Robert B. Parker at the time, Sarah Paretsky I was reading, and then Sue Grafton a little later. And I just said, I'd like to try to do this. These are books that really interest me. And not even mentioning the Golden Age, for example, which I certainly love and have read and reread many times. But it was just there was a period where I just said, these are interesting books. I love, the challenge of correcting or righting a wrong, restoring order, if you will. And it's the structure of any genre, or the way the plots and the stories and the commonplaces and stereotypes fall together. They don't preclude making great writing out of it. And I think every genre has good writing, great writing, mediocre writing, and bad writing. And that goes for literary fiction, it goes for romance, it goes for mysteries and thrillers and crime fiction as well, science fiction, everything. Yeah. So I just enjoyed the mystery genre, and I think mine do fall into really more the mystery genre than say thrillers or crime fiction. And it was just a thing that appealed to me, and I think it's a great structure to work within to create compelling stories and books.
Well, you mentioned the golden age of mystery writers, and there's a lot in this series that appeals to readers who like to ponder the puzzles of human nature. They enjoy tracking clues through the literary footwork and kind of common sense sleuthing. Do you think that the golden age of mystery writers, do you think those authors are relevant for today's readers and writers?
I'm not sure if they are, but I think they should be. I think that they are wonderfully constructed stories that have really stood the test of time. I do believe in many of the rules that were put forward at that time for how to write a mystery. There are some odd ones as well that maybe aren't applicable today. For example, you can only have one secret passage or something. That was one of the golden age, the group that came up with the rules.
Nice.
In a story, you could only have one secret passage, not two. But I don't have any secret passages in my books. But the one that I just believe is the sine qua non. It's the one rule that you have to follow, and that is you have to play fair with the reader. You have to give the reader the same clues that you're giving to your protagonist. Now, your protagonist or your detective may know more about a subject than the reader, but that's fair. But you can't hide the clue, or you can't withhold the clue. You can certainly hide it in a jumble of other clues, which is what we do, and it's the hardest thing I find, and I think that. We sometimes call it hiding the murderer in plain sight, which is what you have to do. And I believe that the writers like Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers were just masterful. And I love both of them, and I particularly admire the timelines and the plotting of say Dorothy L. Sayers, and just the depth of I don't want to call it research, but the details that she puts into her stories. Whether it's about bells or tides or train schedules. She just was a master at that.
Beautiful.
And I
Well,
think writers today can learn a lot from, especially writers today can learn a lot from the Golden Age writers.
well, that's good to hear. I'm a big fan of them too. I like what you said about especially about the way that they skillfully put in the detail. That's really interesting. I got to go back and look at that again. In your book, No Stone Unturned, one of the characters is with Ellie. I don't want to say who. I don't want to give anything away because it's a mystery. But the character says, "Luck is for the unprepared." And he takes her hand and then he says, "Good planning is the better strategy." I just loved that quote when I read it. It could be chilling or it could be good advice, depending, and you skillfully set that ambiguity. Dialogue is so important in a mystery. What has helped you to develop realistic conversations in your books? Because we readers are hanging on every word of that dialogue.
Well, I would say this. I think that what we really are striving for is the appearance of realistic dialogue. Because if we put realistic dialogue or realistic, narratives as well into our stories, we would probably bore our readers to death. In real life, people, they hesitate, they hem, they haw, they search for words, they restart their sentences, and it would make for quite tedious dialogue, but very realistic. By the same token, if we were to, if our hero is driving to a restaurant or to an office building to confront the killer or someone else or witness, in movies and in books, they just pull right up in front, jump out of the car and run inside. In real life, that wouldn't happen. You'd circle the block 3 times looking for a parking space. You'd, fiddle, fish for change in your pocket to put in the parking meter, something like that. And that would be very realistic, but incredibly, boring, or at least it would slow down your story tremendously. So what it is I think of it as trying to create the impression of realistic dialogue. And to do that, you really do need to work on the revision stage quite a bit. I find that I cut down dialogue quite a bit in that stage of the editing, and I do it over and over again. And you try to obviously include the most important and the most salient parts of the dialogue that will give you a sense of the character, as well as the information that you're trying to communicate to between the characters and with the readers as well.
Well, that's really interesting. Just like the dialogue, it makes it more interesting. What is it?
And also I would say, sorry, I would also add, it's really important. I've talked about this before, to try to give each character something of his or her own voice as well. I've seen television shows, just to give an example, sitcoms where it seems to me that every character has the same sense of humor, and the jokes are just they could have been said by one character or another. It doesn't really matter. Now, many shows don't do it that way, but I'm saying I have seen those, and I think that's something to avoid. So whereas Ellie is very well educated and her, she speaks very well and she speaks very precisely with good grammar. I mean, obviously she can adjust her, the register depending on the person she's speaking with. But I also have, she's speaking with people who don't necessarily have a good education, or who speak in a different way and who speak more in a kind of a vernacular or an everyday type, language. And so, they don't all speak like they're college graduates, that kind of thing. I think it's important to distinguish speaking styles among your characters.
Yes, you're right. That's really true in your series. I can picture that now in what I've read. What is it about the 1960s that most appealed to you when you first had the inspiration for the series?
Well, I mentioned earlier that I like writing and reading historical things, and something this precise era I settled on for a variety of reasons. A couple of them were the exact year isn't that important, but that was due to a subplot that I needed to be about 15 years removed from the Second World War. the end of the Second World War. So 1960 worked for that one. But I chose that general era because I wanted, when I, came up with the idea for Ellie, I wanted a young, smart, woman who wants a career. This is before feminism. It's before, before any organized or at least huge cultural movement or women's rights that came a little bit later.
Right.
It's before the sexual revolution. It's before the civil rights movement really made, the most major steps forward. I wanted a time period like that to really, in a very mean way, to create obstacles for my character.
Oh.
I mean, it's hard enough for a detective to solve a mystery, or even if she is a newspaper writer or whatever kind of policeman or any other type of investigator. But I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if and this was really the genesis of Ellie Stone and this series, is what if, on top of all of that, every day she went into work, people, discounted her. They thought she, they looked past her. They thought they thought of her as the girl reporter, in quotation marks. They thought she should probably, go home and raise a family or fetch the coffee or be there for them to pat on the behind in the office.
Yeah.
So Ellie, deals with all that. And of course, in her case, it's kind of galling. Well, it is very galling for her because she's smarter than all of these men and anyone else in the room, and harder working, and I did want to put her in that era because I mentioned also the sexual revolution, and Ellie describes herself, as a matter of fact, in the very first book, and I think even her behavior bears this out in other books. She describes herself as a modern girl, again in quotes. If we remember the early 60s, yes, things seem to be much more conservative than today. However, I think we would be fooling ourselves if we thought that some, young women at the time didn't occasionally have a fling with someone. And remember that Helen Gurley Brown's Sex and the Single Girl came out in 1962. And and it's kind of a perfect book in many ways for the period to point to for Ellie's behavior. I mean, she's I have been known to say in the past, she's a very nice person. She's just not a nice girl.
I like
so
that.
She does occasionally fall into bed with someone, but she's got an incredible morality and a code of right and wrong. It's just that to her, that's not wrong.
Well, your characters come across very genuine to me in that their life events and emotions shape them. And actually, they kind of reminded me of a quote from David Thoreau's Walden: "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." And then the passage skips on to, "But it's a characteristic of wisdom not to do desperate things." Of course, I think that in mysteries, those with the desperation motive, who also have means and opportunity, are going to need a larger dose of wisdom to resist acting. But it's fascinating as you reveal each character's backstory of personal struggles through the course of the books. Do you know all about your characters before you write them in your book? And if so, has a character ever surprised you?
I would say some, yes, and others, more or less, and then others in a way that changes completely through, from the beginning of the book to the end and surprises me, which is bound to happen if you sit in front of the screen for hundreds of hours writing these stories. You're going to get new ideas as you go. I mean, I work from an outline. It's not like a Jeffrey Deaver outline that's 150 pages long, but it's like 5 good pages that says everything that happens in the book in order. And then, of course, some of that might change, but at least it's a roadmap to follow. And the same is true for the characters. But I have been surprised a few times, probably more than, if I thought about it, more than even that. But in Stone Cold Dead, which is the third book, there was a character, a young juvenile delinquent, that Ellie has to interview, trying to locate the missing young girl, and this was her boyfriend. And so the junior high girl disappeared just before Christmas, slipped off the school bus and then disappeared and never was seen again. And this Joey Figlio is his name, and he's this 16-year-old juvenile delinquent. He's in reform school nearby, and he is crazy. I mean, I originally envisioned him as being just a minor character with an interview or two, and he just kind of said, no, I'm going to be bigger than that in the book, and he blossomed into this amazing character. I thought, just like this troubled teen who was I think crazy and violent, but also had his idea fixed on who was to blame for this, and he kept escaping from the place, and he kept stealing Ellie's car on 2 occasions at least. And he was a really funny character ultimately with some of the things he tries to pull off, because he's just a 15-year-old kid and he's not very bright. So he was one. Another one, I think, in Cast the First Stone, the one that's set in Hollywood in 1962. The police sergeant, John Millard, he started out in my mind as just this, kind of a corrupt cop, just your typical cop of that era in a noirish type setting, who's tough and who, talks, street talk and all that. But he actually blossomed into, I think, a much more three-dimensional character who, despite his, designs on Ellie and his creepy date that he arranges with her, turns out to be kind of something noble inside of him, at least as I think Ellie calls it, a kernel of goodness or something that she didn't recognize at first. And in the end, they kind of have a mutual respect for each other, despite the really awkward date that he took her on, and she agreed to try to get information on the case.
Well, I was excited to hear that you're going to be a guest speaker at the Sisters in Crime Puget Sound chapter meeting in January, and that you're involved with the Sisters in Crime, and you've written author profiles for the Big Thrill newsletter of the International Thriller Writers. Is it important that writers engage with a community of writers, or is writing really a solitary pursuit?
Oh, I think it's incredibly important because it's so solitary. And you left out, or I don't know if you left out, but the writers' conferences and symposia, things like that. It's so great to meet your fellow writers and to spend time with them in a relaxed atmosphere as well, or on panels, because I won't say you're really exchanging ideas, because nobody wants their ideas taken, but certainly war stories, and you've got a sympathetic ear or an encouraging, pat on the back, just some encouragement. And I think that that's invaluable. I find that the great mystery writer conferences, they're my favorite times of the year. So BoucherCon is a wonderful, BoucherCon, Left Coast Crime, the international, the Thriller Fest rather, which is more for thrillers than for mysteries, but they welcome mystery writers as well. But there's also Malice Domestic. Oh, now I'm going to forget some of these. Magna Cum Murder. There are new ones springing up every year as well. Killer Nashville. There's so many great conferences that I haven't even attended all of them. California Crime Writers they do it every other year, and it's a wonderful conference. So, and I've made so many great friends in this industry. That's been, probably the most surprising thing, is that I didn't think that when I went to my first BoucherCon in Albany in 2013, I didn't know I was going to start meeting people who would really become great friends, and yet that's what happened.
Nice. Well, I was curious, why did you choose to write your series in first person?
I think when I was thinking of murder mysteries, when I first started writing them, I thought that first person, it has a noirish feel to it, I would say. I like that first person narrative. I think it works really well. And I also, in my case, and in the case of Ellie Stone, I feel that every word she writes, every word she says, every word, every event she narrates, every scene tells you something not only about what's happening in the book, but it tells you something about her as well. The way she looks at the world, the way she looks at these other, the person she's describing or interacting with. So that's why I liked it. And I there's somehow vaguely I feel it fits really well for a noir. And I wouldn't call my book exactly noir, but I think it's noirish, certainly at times, my books. And I thought that was a really nice way to tell the story of the investigation is through the investigator's eyes.
Well, would you treat us now to a little reading from one of your Ellie Stone mysteries?
I could try. It's funny whenever I'm asked to do a reading, the elephant in the room is that I'm reading as a 20-something young woman in the first person, and I'm a man of a certain age, and probably weigh 100 pounds more than Ellie Stone weighs. She's a small person, and she's physically very, unremarkable in the sense she's not a big tough broad who's going to beat up miscreants, and she's no V.I. Warshawski. She doesn't know how to shoot a gun, never has held one, but she's tough, and she's tough mentally and I think spiritually as well. But anyway, I always have to find a passage that doesn't require too much femininity, so to speak, when I read it, because my voice would probably just ruin that. And I also tell, especially people that I know, for God's sake, when you read the book, don't try to hear my voice as you're reading it. That's not...
I never thought of that obstacle that you have to get over. Okay, we're going to have to suspend our disbelief.
Yeah, well, and actually, it's very interesting. I got a request. I don't know if it's going to happen at the next Left Coast, but somebody was proposing a panel where the authors would appear on the panel, assuming the role of their detectives. And I was asked, would I come on and do Ellie Stone? And I said, you know what? If they approve that panel, I'll do it. It'll be strange, and it might be a total disaster that ruins my career, but I'll give it a try. So this is from A Stone's Throw, which is, as I mentioned, coming out next June 5th, 2018. And we are now in August of 1962. And that's the height, that is the racing season at the thoroughbred racing season in Saratoga, as I mentioned. So, Chapter 1, Saturday, August 11th, 1962. The flames leapt into the last of the night's darkness, casting their dancing orange light against the weathered planks of the nearby outbuildings. The fire had engulfed the entire structure, a horse barn, swallowing it whole, from its timber walls to its pitched roof and wrought iron weather vane at the top. I watched from a safe distance, shielding my face from the heat with my hands. Deep inside the blaze, boards and beams whistled and popped, crackling as they withered and wasted under the assault of the fire. And when the last of the three walls collapsed upon themselves, the roof fell and sent a great cartwheeling ball of pyrotechnics skyward, spitting sparks and setting alight the cool August night, just as if day had broken. Then, flattened and starved of its fuel, the fire exhausted itself within minutes. Soon, it could manage no more than a hissing black smoke. All went dark again.
Oh, very good.
Well, just a tease. shared some of this with some friends, and they all gasped and said, "Oh my God, please tell us there's no horses in that barn."
That was my immediate thought. Was sometimes I know during fires horses will run back into a barn. So
remember actually in the very next paragraph, it's revealed that this is an abandoned farm. There's nobody there. So,
good. Okay.
So don't worry. It's not a spoiler. There are no horses harmed in that fire.
All right. Okay. Well, Jim, I have a few questions for you as well, and I really want to delve into the development of your female protagonist, the amateur sleuth Ellie Stone. You've mentioned she's certainly liberated. She's intelligent. She's often snarky. I enjoy that most of all. Always witty and very independent, and clearly has a fondness for attractive men and doer scotch. Considering the double standard of the 60s, she's quite unapologetic about her single status and her sex life. And from my own writing perspective, I'm currently trying to get inside the head of a 1918 American doughboy in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Mm-hmm. And it's a very difficult task. So I've got to ask, how did you channel the mindset of this unique female character so well?
Well, thank you for that, Julie. And I think I would say you have one advantage, and it's the same advantage that I have. The advantage is distance and time. If I were trying to write a 25-year-old woman today, I probably would fail miserably at it, I think. But it's that distance to the early 1960s that helps me. Nobody is living in the 1960s right now. Many people remember them, but it's through the glass and through the mists of time. So we're all looking back at it kind of from a similar perspective. Some people might say, well, I was a young woman in 1962, and this is totally unrealistic. I don't know, but life and humanity is kind of a continuum. You've got a little bit of everything along the scale. So I don't think it's fair to say, oh, no woman would ever do this or that, or no man would ever do this or that. And also I've never murdered anyone, but I write about people murdering people. And I think, Julie, you have the same advantage writing about a doughboy in 1918. Nobody's alive who was a doughboy in 1918. Right. So nobody's, you still need to, try to create what today we think a doughboy in 1918 would have felt like, and would have thought and would have done. So I would say that can help you. The other thing about the character and the double standards of the 60s, in Ellie's case, her sex life and single status and drinking, for example, I consciously did want to kind of turn the commonplace on its head, of the hard-boiled detective who, sleeps, goes through women like a hot knife through butter and, never settles down and, that kind of thing. I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if it were a woman doing, displaying some of this similar behavior?
Definitely.
I definitely wanted to do that. And, it's funny. I think people react well to it and some don't. Some say, oh, I worry about Ellie, which is nice if that tells me that they like her at least. Or some people probably don't like her because sometimes they think she's too snarky and maybe the sense of humor doesn't appeal to everyone. That's what makes a horse race. But, so I was going to say that, so these same people, other people have also asked me, oh, I love that she's this way, but when is she going to settle down with a nice guy? and I just want to say that that's the whole point. That's the whole point. She may, but that's not what she needs to complete her in this fictional world that I've created for her. I want her to be, I don't know if she'll be forever young and forever single, but for now I certainly, and I deal with that. I deal with that in Heart of Stone, where that is about her falling for someone.
Yes.
And you'll have to read it to find out what happens, but one would have to read it. But it's not in my it's not in her future to marry a cop so that then she has someone to feed her the clues or to help when she needs this or that. Ellie gets by befriending cops and by being their kind of like their sweetheart, and if she can. I mean, now in Los Angeles, it was a little different. That cop was a little too he was a big city cop, and he said, things don't work like that here. Sorry. But in her small town, the cops don't like her, but the sheriff's department really does. And so she's very close to the sheriff, who looks at her as a daughter, kind of. And so she gets by. I mean, she gets help that way, but it's not from having a boyfriend who is a policeman or something of that sort. So I did want to kind of stand that convention on its head and make a female character who, while she's not going to be beating up guys and kicking ass and taking names, she is going to display some of the behavior of these male stereotypical or conventional detectives that we've seen, like your Philip Marlowe. And then I always ask the people who say, when is she going to settle down? I always ask them, well, did you ever ask Lee Child when Jack Reacher is going to settle down?
Good point.
So.
Well, she's sort of an outlier for her era, which I think makes her very interesting.
And I think that's fair, and I think I did that on purpose. Of course, yes, some of her behavior is a little bit surprising for the era, although there were certainly people who did those things. But that's why we try to write and create interesting characters, not boring characters. So I did want her to have some flaws and to make some bad decisions and to have the reader cringe sometimes and say, "Oh my God, don't do that," or So.
Truly. Well, I love some of your protagonist's asides. As I mentioned, she's witty and often snarky, and her descriptions of some of the characters she encounters in the midst of her investigations. I'm thinking specifically of the slovenly sheriff in Heart of Stone, Sheriff Terwilliger. And Ellie describes him getting into her small car like this: his great big behind spread across the bench seat like a pandemic in search of victims. And I've just got to say, where do you come up with this material?
Well, it's coming somehow from inside, but I think Ellie's character, that's the character she is. She looks at that, and as I was alluding to before, that's what I love about first-person narrative. A third-person narrator would be, it'd be hard-pressed to describe people this way, I think.
Right.
It can be done, but then it becomes kind of a humorous, or it becomes just an odd kind of a thing that shocks you. Here, it's just, oh yes, Ellie looks at people that way, and if someone is nice and kind to her, she would never say negative. She would never describe them in this awful way. But if the person, like Terwilliger, who is an odious, oily, terrible man from the get-go.
Yes.
So she zeroes in on whatever foible or whatever thing she can describe. I think the first thing she notices about him, or one of the first things on the dock at the lake, is when he approaches and she notices the handgun sticking out of his, it's trapped between his considerable belly and the waistband of his pants, as if it had been suffocated trying to squeeze its way out, something like that. So she looks at people, and yes, she I don't know if it's snarky, or I think at times it's snarky, but it's woe to you if you offend her, because she will cut you down with her wit. And I like to put in some of that stuff. I think you've read some of these books. I think you've read most of them, if not all. But these books are serious. I mean, the crimes are not taken lightly. It's not like, oh yes, the victim was another politically incorrect, ecologically incorrect developer, so nobody cares that he died.
Exactly.
You do find, and I have no problem with books like that. They're fun. You don't have to feel bad about the victim. But in my books, Ellie does feel bad about the victims.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
And she really has a connection to them. The young man in Heart of Stone, for example, the young 16-year-old boy who falls to his death.
Yes, the teenager.
And she has a very touching moment with his dead body, to, in a sense, trying to comfort him.
Yes.
In the moments after.
She has empathy as a character,
Yeah.
which I think makes her so relatable for us as readers.
Exactly. And it's funny that empathy goes hand in hand, at least in her case, with this kind of, wicked sense of humor, too, where she can cut somebody down to size. And a cynicism that goes along with an idealism. They seem to be, direct opposites. And yet I think that many cynical people are cynical because they're idealistic. And at least in Ellie's case, and not that she's a total cynic, but she's not a Pollyanna, that's for sure.
That's for sure. Well, I'm going to move ahead to one of our next questions. In your Ellie Stone series, Jim, you deal with some fairly heavy, serious topics, including certainly the era's sexism, the racism, homophobia, and then there's the cultural clash, at least in Heart of Stone, of Jew versus Gentile, socialist versus John Bircher, the Manhattanite versus the rural small town dwellers. And yet, as a reader, we never feel like you're hitting us over the head. Your characters speak their minds, and through that, they reveal who they are. Are there any tips you'd give to writers for handling sensitive subjects like these in a mystery?
Sure. I think, first of all, it's great to have these clashes among your characters, because it creates conflict, and that's what makes things interesting. I mean, I loved putting the John Birchers in, up against the left wing, basically communists.
Communists, yes.
In Heart of Stone, and just for good measure, there's a group of evangelicals on the lake that summer as well, doing a crusade.
Yes.
And it's funny, I have my college roommate is he was joking with me, and he's a conservative, and he said, "Oh, when he heard about this book that I was writing, he said, "Yo, you're going to make the John Birchers you're going to make them look really stupid or really bad, right?" And I said, "No, I'll make them look as stupid as the left-wing communists in my book, because not stupid, but as flawed and as ridiculous." The one of the things that emerges in Heart of Stone, among this community of artists and intellectual left-wing Jewish communists, basically living on this lake, is that they're just as misogynistic as any, Christian evangelical or at that time, where you might expect.
I noticed that, yes.
Yeah, and I think that it's an equal opportunity scourge. We've seen it. My God, recently, look at what's been in the news. I mean, with, you can be a liberal Hollywood, mogul and still, do all of these awful things and think of women in these ways. So, but in terms of putting these different types together and tips, I think once you do kind of throw them into a bag together, you're going to get interesting reactions that will emerge in your fiction because of that. So I would advise that. I also like the idea of taking people out of their element. I think we touched on that earlier. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting to see Ellie, who in this small town is right off the bat out of her element. She comes from Manhattan, and she grew up in Manhattan, the daughter of a famous academic, and her mother was a very successful art dealer, an influential art dealer, and now she's in this small dying mill town, and she's Jewish, living in a town where there are very few Jews. And so she's a bit of an outsider, but she has charm and wit and makes her way. She runs into some people who don't like her, of course, but she also charms others, tremendously. So I think all of those things, I think it's very interesting to put diametrically opposed people into a bag and see what happens, or into a ring, and I really think a lot of it will come naturally to the writer if you do that.
Well, conflict is always the most interesting thing, I think, to write about. So I think you're absolutely right. I have a noir fiction question for you. Ellie does have a somewhat cynical life view at times, but as you mentioned, she operates fairly inside the legal and ethical constraints of her times, and she's not the stereotypical bitter, washed-up alcoholic gumshoe who's hit bottom. You said you consider her noirish. So would she actually be noir, or is she more of a transitional kind of character?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a blend of noirish elements with traditional mystery elements. It's not she's not cozy at all.
No.
And nothing wrong with cozy. I'm just saying cozy is what it is, and it's not hard-boiled either. It's somewhere in the middle, but there are, gritty descriptions of places and moods, and I really think noir is about mood, much more, well, very much about mood and less about community, say, that whereas a cozy might be more about a group of people or a community of people. So I also like to think, I set out to try to make her as realistic as I possibly could. Look, we all have to suspend our disbelief. Nobody's character is realistic, or else that character, as I mentioned earlier, would be incredibly boring, probably, Most of us are not all that interesting, and so we chip away the parts that are not interesting, and we're left with the cool stuff. But Ellie, for example, I mean, while it's possible that that she could be a larger woman who liked firearms or who studied karate or something, she isn't. She's just just an average in that sense, just an average person. She's physically unimposing, and she only gets by on her wits. I also try to inject small details, but it's like that dialogue and the car driving around the block 3 times that I mentioned before. You pepper these details in just to give some sense of realism or verisimilitude. For example, I'll talk about how at the paper she's asked to do other stories that are not as interesting. Now, to talk in great detail about those uninteresting stories would really make the story or the book boring. But still, she's in a small town. She has to report on potholes, or she has to report on somebody's garden party.
Yes.
Things like that, especially something like a garden party for a girl reporter. But she wants to write about the murders. And she did, and I think it was in, Stone Cold Dead, she had to interview the 10-year-old spelling bee winner. And he was a total dud, and as you might expect. And the word that he won with was something so simple that. And she made sure she also is a photographer for the paper. She uses her camera very often to help in her investigations. But so she sometimes will take pictures for the paper, where you wear, in a small town you might wear more than one hat at the paper. And she made sure that she took one frame only of this kid, and she made sure that his eyes were closed in the picture.
Oh my gosh.
So there are noirish elements, to go back to your question, but it's not traditional noir, but there are parts, and there are humorous parts in the books, as you've pointed out, even some absurd farcical events, like when somebody falls down the stairs trying to run away from her her apartment in Stone Cold Dead and knocks himself out doing a half gainer going down the stairs, something like that. But I mix that with the realism of, I hope, of true tragedy when someone is murdered, and Ellie's empathy for those people. So
yeah, that very much comes through. I recently read an interview, Jim, that you'd done with the Chicago Review of Books, where you talked about becoming a writer as a lifelong process. And since I'm still waiting for a New York editor to get back to me on a manuscript, I can completely relate to that feeling. Gail Lynn's recently described it to me as that long, cold silence that many writers must endure. So tell us more about your personal odyssey into becoming a writer. And it sounds like, from things you mentioned to Wendy earlier, that it didn't happen overnight. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I remember the days back in the 80s when I was sending out query letters with self-addressed stamped envelopes to, usually it was agents, I suppose. There might have been a publisher or two that would accept unsolicited manuscripts or at least query letters, and then waiting for months for an answer. And I remember at the time adhering to the rule, oh, you don't, no simultaneous submissions. And it's just like, can you make it any more difficult? Should I tie my hand behind my back too?
There you go.
There you go. It's and finally later, well, what happened was I wrote my first novel at 12. It was a World War I mystery, interestingly enough. And it was a terrible book.
Most first books are.
Yeah, I mean, it was just awful. I still have a copy of it, a hard copy of it, but I typed it myself. But and then I wrote in college. I wrote a short, kind of an academic-based novel because I thought I knew everything at that point. And that was a little better. Oh, it was much better, but it was still bad. And then in graduate school, I wrote a huge historical novel on that took place in the Second World War in occupied France. And that was getting better, but still not good. It must have been 200,000 words. It was just ridiculously long. Then career, as I mentioned before, career and life get in the way. You start working and you want to be a writer, but 4, 5, 6 years go by and you haven't written a thing. And then I started reading mysteries in the 80s, and that's when I finally wrote the first thing that was, getting there. At least it was, better. I found an agent with that, and that book never sold. So, and then I wrote another one in that same series, and that didn't sell. The agent couldn't sell it, and then we parted company with me thinking, oh, of course I'll just get a new agent, And that was about 1991, and next thing I know, it's 2006, and I haven't written anything new in years. And so, but I said, if I'm not going to do it now, when am I going to do it? So, so I revamped the book, the last book I wrote for that agent in New York, which was a cozy, actually. And it was, it never got published, but it did get me my new agent. And he has not been able to sell it. But then the next book was the first Ellie Stone book. And now we've sold 6 of those, and actually we're working on the details for the 7th one with the publisher.
Great.
Right now, they wanted to do 2 more, but I thought let's do 1 more, and then we'll see after that. But just in case I want to take a 1-year break and write something else. But so then finally, then of course I've got a new agent now in 2009, I think it was, and I thought, oh, it's just I'll have a book deal next week, and then it was 3.5 years later before he finally sold the first Ellie Stone book. And it was just so, yeah, it's the long, what is it she said, the long cold silence.
The long cold silence, yes.
And all I can say is you just keep writing, and you just keep writing something new, and at a certain point you've got to give up on or put it aside, the book, the first book, and write the second, and then write the third, because it was probably my 7th or 8th, and I needed to write out all the bad words, in other words, the poor words, and become a better writer. And I hope I'm still improving and getting better. So it does not happen overnight. It does for some people, and we hate those people. But.
We do, yes, we truly do. So true. Mm-hmm. Well, it's sort of the stages of a process, definitely.
Exactly.
Well, we started with the magic of books, and I'm going to continue with this question. How do we spread the magic? I've got a few suggestions. If you're book shopping at Barnes & Noble this holiday season, you'll be asked at checkout if you want to donate a child's book to a child who perhaps has none. Just say yes. It's a modest cost. They'll add it on your bill. Or ask your local bookseller if they have a similar program. Many of them do. Volunteer at your library. I know Wendy does this often in her community library. Or pledge some funds to your local library system. Volunteer at your local elementary school for a program such as Eager Readers, where you go in once a week to help children who are struggling to read, encouraging them and charting their progress. I've actually done it, and it's a very rewarding way to give back. And you could always encourage a budding writer in your own family by getting them some good writing craft books to get started. Here's three top picks: On Writing by Stephen King, Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott, and Writing Down the Bones by Natalie Goldberg. There's also a subscription to Writer's Digest magazine, which appeals to writers of all levels, even teens. I just read the acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize in Literature awarded to Kazuo Ishiguro, and he closes his address with a very appropriate thought for this time we live in that speaks to the power and magic of books. He said, "Good writing and good reading will break down barriers." In closing, I stumbled across this historical tidbit, perhaps one to share with a young, reluctant reader. Over 500 years ago, Galileo saw reading as a way of having superhuman powers, and surely that's the best definition of magic. Over to you, Wendy.
Nice. Well, I want to talk about book fairies. Do you believe in fairies? Have you seen a book fairy? There's lots of them, and they've been working magic in the Seattle area this year. Actress Emma Watson, she's famously known as Hermione in the Harry Potter movies, she helped to launch the Book Fairies, which is a worldwide organization devoted to book sharing by leaving books as gifts everywhere, just in ordinary places like buses, park benches, restaurants, small mom and pop stores after you ask permission. The books are tied up with a green ribbon, and they have a Book Fairy sticker on the front. And the organization was actually founded by Cordelia Oxley in London. It's truly international. It's in many countries now and spreading. So check out Book Fairies Seattle on Instagram for some fairy sightings. The international organization's site is IBelieveInBookFairies.com. A book fairy can drop any book that he or she enjoyed or can participate in a specific book campaign for a period of time in a geographic region. It's so wonderful to know that there are book fairies in the world uniting book lovers and encouraging the joy of reading. I'm a believer. Every time books are found, fairies earn their wings. Jim, if you were to be a book recommendation fairy for our listeners, which book would you recommend to them?
Well, probably not my own, so I won't do that.
Well, we already recommend your
yeah.
books.
But you know what? I would recommend two books that I just finished quite recently. The first is by Laurie R. King, and it's a book that's been around for 25 years, I think. The Beekeeper's Apprentice.
Oh,
just
yes.
a book that just took my breath away. I don't know why I was surprised, but I hadn't read it before, and it just drew me in right away. It was so well written, so believable, and just a beautiful, beautiful book, and a real success. And Laurie is just an awesome writer with a lot of success, obviously. But also recently, I read a book by Jennifer Kinchlow, who writes a series set in 1907 Los Angeles, featuring a young society girl named Anna Blanc. And it is just the most charming, funny, madcap adventures. The most recent book is called The Woman in the Camphor Trunk. Camphor as in, the Camphor. Set in Chinatown in Los Angeles in 1908. Just a brilliantly funny, wonderful historical book. I recommend the two. So that's Jennifer Kinchlow and Laurie R. King. Anything that they write.
Very nice. Well, I'm going to recommend a book called Writing Mysteries. It's a handbook by the Mystery Writers of America. Whether as a writer or as a reader, I like hearing directly from authors about their books. How is it they come up with their stories? How do they make them so enticing? How they weave that storytelling magic. I like talking about their stories. And that's what's so wonderful about the BoucherCon conference that we were talking about earlier, the World Mystery Convention for readers, writers, publishers, booksellers, and all lovers and fans of crime fiction. By the way, it was named in honor of Anthony Boucher, the distinguished mystery fiction critic, editor, and author. Anyway, this book has the same kind of broad appeal as that fan and writer convention. Writing Mysteries was edited by Sue Grafton, and this book's chapters are each written by a different mystery author. There are more than 20. As Sue Grafton says in her foreword, aside from their technical proficiency, mystery writers are the magicians of fiction. We're the illusionists, working with sleight of hand in the performance of our art. With this book, we'll be taking you behind the scenes so you can see how the riddles are created and the illusions sustained. Keep in mind that the mystery is the one form in which the reader and the writer are pitted against each other. It's a great quote, and I find that this book is a wonderful glimpse behind the curtain and also a great reminder that beyond the specifics of the writing craft, each author's journey is unique and personal. And as Gregory MacDonald says, a novel, to be novel, must be novel. See, there's that magic ingredient part again.
True.
Absolutely. And that is a wonderful quote from Sue Grafton, that about the reader and writer being pitted against each other. If I can just say, we run into this, and you surely heard it as well. If the reader guesses your murderer, they just, shake their head in pity at you, you poor thing. And if they don't guess it, then they're angry at you sometimes, but unless you've played completely fair. And that's why you have to play fair.
Back
but
rule.
Somebody's bound to guess the murderer. There are only so many characters to guess, among, so that's going to happen.
Good point. My recommendation is actually a film this time. It's a 2017 film called 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. And let me warn you at the outset that it has an R rating, deservedly so, for the pervasive foul language, as well as scenes of extremely brutal physical violence. It's not a feel-good holiday movie by any stretch of the imagination. Frances McDormand gives us what should be an Oscar-nominated performance as an iron-willed woman in a small town who has nothing left to lose after the rape and murder of her teenage daughter. She's a character who's been pushed too far, faced with no leads and no arrests. She steps into the hornet's nest and truly stirs things up by paying for 3 billboards outside her rural town, pushing for answers and challenging the sheriff to do something, anything. This film, in spite of the violence, is a surprisingly thoughtful one with literary references scattered throughout, if you're observant. It's also a film of contrasts. There's shocking and graphic physical violence, outrageous hilarity, elements of surprising forgiveness, and even, at times, moments of transcendent grace that may make you cry. There's outstanding, unforgettable acting by Woody Harrelson, Sam Rockwell, Peter Dinklage, and others. An ambiguous ending will make you wonder what happens next to these characters. Even the very picky New York Times film reviewer loved this film. I highly recommend it, but again, it's not for everyone. It's already received Golden Globe nominations. And Wendy saw it as well. What did you think?
I agree. It's a great recommendation for an adult audience. The billboards were actually real. The filmmaker, Martin McDonough, took a Greyhound bus in the late 90s across several states. He did this often because he's fascinated with the so-called flyover states, and he wanted a ground's eye view. At one time, he drove through a rural town down south and spied billboards in a field. And the first one said, "Why wasn't this case solved?" And there were more that were related. And he says that the rage communicated really stuck with him. and he kept wondering who would rent giant signs to chastise the police about not solving a crime. And then he thought, what if? What if it was a grieving mom? And it went from there.
It's definitely a challenging film, but definitely adults only. Well, that's it for another segment of Kendall and Cooper Talk Mysteries. We'd like to thank our special guest, best-selling writer and recent Anthony Award winner, Jim Ziskin, for joining us and telling us more about his series. We're waiting for more of his twisty mysteries set in the 60s, featuring the lively and liberated protagonist, Ellie Stone. To echo Anne Lamott's words at the beginning of this program, we wish for all of you a new year filled with music, comfort, and excitement in exactly the right proportions. Our best wishes to you for a peaceful holiday season. Keep reading and keep writing.